To Be Fair was the name of our company newsletter many years ago. And, you know, it was about trying to educate the public. I guess this is in part, some of the public may see this, but a lot of this will be about us educating ourselves. And to just suggest that I am the guru is incorrect entirely. Collectively, our collective knowledge way outweighs my knowledge individually. So hopefully what we'll be seeing will be lots of sharing of information, and some of that will be wrong, some of that will be right. And one of the things that I often am surprised about is how much things have changed in one generation, my generation. So I'm an old arborist, that's the grey here. Peter's got a little bit more than me and a little less up here, so he's probably wiser still. But, you know, I've been a second generation arborist, and I'm amazed at the things that we were taught were absolute truths 40 years ago are now not absolute truths, and things that were not ever acceptable. You know, now we're starting to see things like, you know, environmental pruning or coronet pruning and things like that, you know, complete changes. So we will certainly see some of that in terms of the stuff that we discuss. So whatever we discuss here, make sure that you go away, do your due diligence, read, attempt to prove us wrong. That's what really good research is about, is proving the other party wrong. Trying to prove your opinion is right. Try and prove yourself wrong. You'll always get a lot further in the process of your education. So, Peter, we've got a basic agenda for tonight. And I guess the first thing we need to do is talk about what is a disease. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, okay, good. And this is one of those changes that's occurred. In the earlier days, we used to do pests and diseases. And that was very a horticultural approach. Medicine at the same time started to say, well, look, hang on a second here. If you've got worms, you've got a disease. If you've got scabies, you've got a disease. If you've got alcoholism, you've got a disease. You know, if you're a drug addict, you've got a disease. All these things that were, if you're depressed, you've got a disease. And so all these things became diseases, and a disease is defined as anything that affects the normal or proper function of the organism. So in the case of trees, it's anything that affects the normal or proper function of the tree. And so that could be something that's really desirable. For example, it might be a prostate form, or it might be a variegation. So it may be something that, you know, it has horticultural advantages, but it can still be considered in the context of the parent material still to be a disease. Most things are going to have some effect. And we say, well, is it really an effect unless I'm seeing something really going wrong with the tree? Well, I think we've got to think of trees as an accounting system. That is, trees put a lot of effort, energy, money into making energy. And let's call that energy money, because that'll help us understand it better. So they make money, and this energy component. And they have redundancy. So redundancy means making sure, for example, in your bank account, you can afford all of this year's bills without having to worry about it. If tomorrow you got lay load, put off, sick, you know, whatever it was, you had somebody you had to look after, you could run that whole year without having to go bankrupt or without having to go into debt. That's redundancy. And trees have that redundancy built into them. And they have to have, because they're autotrophs. Autotroph simply means produce your own food. So they produce their own food. So they're not dependent. They can't get these stores of anything. You can't, well, you do get some storage of sunlight. You get the light cycle, or the light dependent, and then the light independent, or the dark cycle, part of photosynthesis that continues on. But apart from that small little bit of chemical storage that goes on throughout the day, they don't have this system that they can store the food producing stuff, the sunlight. So they store the end product, the food. And they store that as stored sugars, predominantly starches. And starch it's a sugar that's joined and joined and joined, folded and folded and folded and folded and folded and folded and aggregated until it is so tight and so complex that it's not water soluble at normal temperatures. And that's really good from a tree's point of view, because one of the things that trees struggle with is water. Okay, plants in general. So conserving water. And the reason they need to do that is lots of water is wasted in the process of their functioning. So if we think of a disease as something that affects it, it means if the plant is taking sugars out of its storage system abnormally, we'll consider that having an adverse effect, even though it may not show any adverse effect, even though it may not be significant in any long-term thing. If we can think of that as still a disease, then what we then need to rate is not just the disease, but the severity of it. So if it's a disease that's non-consequential, so a caterpillar comes along, chews on 10% of the leaves, that's probably non-consequential. A possum comes along and takes off all the leaves, that's probably moderate consequence. If it does it over 2 or 3 years, well, it's probably fatal. So does that help define what we mean when we say a disease?
I think so.
Great. The next thing is diagnosis. And this one's a problem that causes a problem for a lot of people until they think about how that happens in their world. Diagnosis is not an event, it's a process. And I will say that dozens of times during the course of the next couple of years. Diagnosis is a process, not an event. By that I mean, if you've watched the old series Gregory House or Dr. House, if you haven't, watch a couple of episodes, a diagnosis will be given, but a lot of these things you're never really certain. And so you'll come up with a prognosis and a management plan and a prognosis. You'll say, oh, okay, well, if this is that, then you should be doing this. And this is what you should expect to see happen. This is this process of prognosis. And your doctor does it to you. When you go to the doctor and you say, oh, I'm feeling this or that, and he says, look, go home, take these tablets, and everything should start coming back into order within the next 2 or 3 days or the next week. If it doesn't come back and tell me, and I tell a true story of my GP, a lovely guy, very much a Dr. House personality, said to a client, look, go home, take some tablets and for your headache, and cool yourself down. And if it persists and it's still like that in the morning, go see another doctor. It was a Saturday, so Sunday he wasn't working. On the Sunday afternoon, his wife calls and says, my husband has a massive rash on him and he's not getting any better. Can I come and see you? Now, this is 12 hours after he was advised the next step. Okay. He walked into the surgery, Mark took one look at it. It was a purple rash. He said, you've got meningitis. I'm ordering an ambulance now. O was called, an ambulance is on its way. And he died that day because he thought the diagnosis was an event. That is, what the doctor had thought was he'd had some low-grade fever, maybe viral, maybe bacterial, but had no idea that he had meningitis. And his comments were, if it persists into the morning, go get medical attention. The guy said, of course, doctors, well, they know, they're just taking guesses. Well, they are. And as consulting arborists, you're going to take guesses. There'll be times when you're absolutely certain, and there'll be many times when you say, I'm not certain, but let's start down this process and see where we go. Is anyone unhappy with that? Does anyone want to make a comment about that?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much how it rolls.
Yeah, I mean, I wish it wasn't like that. I wish we had we talk about it, the diagnostometer. You just plug it in and all of a sudden you read all the data. Of course, they have those for cars, and cars are, and as complex as their programming is, those machines still get it wrong. So we're not dealing with simple things. We're dealing with fairly complex organisms. And let's put that into a context. When I say we're dealing with fairly complex organisms, trees are one of the most evolved organisms on the face of the earth. Now, I know you're going to say to me, well, Mark, they're very primitive. Well, they've been evolving for the last, longer than people, longer than animals have been around. Plants have been a lot longer. The question is, your thoughts are, well, they're not as superior as us. Well, in many ways, they're superior to us. They're chemically about 20 times more complex than a person, just as a rough round figure. So they're very chemically complex. They're incredibly long-lived. They've got things about them that are really unique. So, for example, recently it was shown that ginkgo biloba, the genetic material doesn't age like our genetic material does. They don't have any of these telomeres that make our genome degrade over time. So a 1,000-year-old ginkgo biloba has the genetics that it had when it was 1 day old. That's pretty amazing. And when they move in the wind, their cell membrane, the living part of the cells, get moved around and they get flexure, and there's a little receptor there that picks up that there's movement, and it sends a little message: grow more cells adjacent and fatten up. Well, we have little receptors in our body that do similar tasks, and we call them synapses or brain cells. Now, I'm not saying they're identical, I'm saying they're analogous. That is, a plant has some of those little receptors in the cell walls, a number of them, and we have ours all concentrated in one spot. One of the advantages of a plant having them all over the place is it's got redundancy. If you lose something, it still goes. It's why Bitcoin has got such a popularity of late is you know, there's this massive blockchain redundancy process that says you can't lose the information. Well, trees have had that going for a few million years from an evolutionary perspective. So that's pretty amazing. But they're organ simple. We're organ complex. So we've got these really fascinating organs that are really unique in their tissue and their structure. And there are many people that argue that that makes us superior. And that's a reasonable argument. At the same time, trees have got the ability to do things that we just can't do. You know, chop off your head, you don't grow a new one. In fact, chop off any limb and you don't grow a new one. And our cells, we're trying to extract these things called stem cells, and you know, there's great work we're doing with it. In fact, all the ethical issues that go with fetal stem cells and all that sort of stuff. Well, you know, ginkgo biloba has thousands of them. They're called parenchyma. Billions, trillions of them in a tree, ready to go, with a original genetic code there. So trees do have some distinct advantages in terms of what we're talking about. So it's whilst we try and treat diseases the same, there are some fundamental differences. And I think that's important to keep in mind. What's the next item on our agenda, Peter?
I don't remember.
You don't remember. Well, I guess that we've defined what a disease is, and we've defined that diagnosis is a process. It involves a number of steps. And if you want a fairly good outline, the new unit, Diagnosed Tree Diseases, has got that outlined. It's probably a bit here and there in a few spots. Thanks, guys, that worked on that unit. But it still probably could be tidied up a bit more. One of the first things we want to do is see whether we can identify the plant or the tree that we're dealing with. And I say plant or tree, and we've talked about this for those of you who've been at war, but what is a tree? Anyone want to give it a guess? Or what's not a tree? Equally as important. Nobody?
A self-supporting, woody, shedding organism.
Yeah, self-supporting, woody. How about if it's a prostrate tree growing on the ground? Is that a tree still? Not self-supporting anymore.
Yeah, that's right, yes.
So maybe it doesn't need to be self-supporting. Maybe just... Sorry?
Sorry, a living organism that has the ability to adapt to its surroundings and change and grow and hopefully survive.
I think that fits all of us here, but I'm not a tree, I'm sure of that. Like to be one, but I'm not. But yes, I think they're qualities of a tree. It's living, it's able to adapt to its environment. I think Peter had some of the qualities there. It's woody, it's shedding. And I remember being in the Czech Republic and having a lecturer hunt me down and say to me, so Mark, I'll see if I can do it with some of the accent. Does this grass have lignin in it? Yes, Fritz, it does. Well, then it is a woody plant, yes. And there's a point which that's true. I mean, we consider bamboo, to be a woody plant that can be huge. I mean, Dendrocalamus giganteum will grow in excess of 40 meters high. That's better than most trees will grow. So trees I'm there using is the dicotyledonous angiosperms and the gymnosperms. And within any of these groups, there are things that just don't like to fit in together. So if you want to throw woody plants, you want to put bamboos in there, palms, all those things, as far as I'm concerned, they're all trees. If it's got woody stuff in it and it's long lived and it's got bits that are shed, then we're the people that they should be talking to. If it's stuff that you can push a lawnmower over and spray off with glyphosate, then that's how we should probably be managing some of it. At least I'd like to manage more of it like that, but my clients seem to still like that turf grass.
So when you say woody, are you referring to secondary or lignified xylem?
No, not necessarily secondary. So for example, a palm has primary xylem, no secondary xylem, and yet I could pick the stem off a Phoenix robellini, Mick, and beat you to death with it fairly easy. That's a device almost made to be a weapon itself. The PDL bases are sharp and hard, and that's woody. So I think if you could pick it up and beat somebody and cause them harm, we'll put that down as a woody. Okay, how's that for a definition?
So anything to do with lignified xylem?
Yeah, but then here's this problem. This is the Fritz problem. Yes, turf grass does have lignified xylem in it. Not a lot, but it's got some. So at some stage or other, we'll cross over. So a shrub and a tree, it's another artificial construct. It's not a scientific construct. And the perfect example I think of is figs. Is a ficus a tree?
I think it is, yes.
Well, what about Ficus familia? It's a creeper. It's not even self-supporting.
Yeah. So,
And there are a whole pile of shrub ficus species that just don't get more than a meter high. And yet I consider all 1,200 plus species to be trees. So I'm very territorial. And I even think about things that aren't normally considered to be trees, like Ipomoea, sweet potato. Ipomoea arborea, and there's one other species, two species that have woody stems that are trees or become, large shrubs to trees.
So what's the difference between a shrub and a tree?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of those things is we've wanted to come up with a definition for these things that aren't based. So a tree is not a scientific construct. It's not something that we can define scientifically. We describe it based on our own subjective views. And shrubs and trees fit in that same category. It's really an arbitrary thing that has no basis in science. It's basis in horticulture, largely defined it. It said, a tree's got a single stem and it's usually one and straight, and it's usually, X high, and shrubs are multi-stemmed and small. But, if I looked at the average Eucalyptus teraticornis, once it gets to about 6 or 7 meters, it's usually multi-stemmed. That's typical of its form. So does that make it a shrub? No, because it's tall. Well, then why shouldn't I have the same thing when it comes to a gardenia? Why shouldn't Gardenia radicanus be a tree for our definition? So I'm happy to keep it as broad as possible. And then if you don't want to deal with it as a plant, you get to a client's property or you're looking after it or you're making decisions. I would never do a risk assessment on a rose. But I've got a tree removal permit approved by Blacktown Council for the removal of a rose because it was more than 3 meters in height and had the potential to grow to more than 5 meters in height. And according to their definition, that made it a tree. Just keep in mind, there isn't this scientific construct of a tree. It's just purely what we want to put on it. It's arbitrary. And to help you see that even better, if we said, oh, look, it's a tree that's got secondary thickening, how about Dracaena Draco? Is that a tree? It's got secondary thickening. How about Rostonia regia, the royal palm? It has secondary thickening. or Jabea chileanensis, massive, the Chilean wine palm, massive secondary thickening, not from a cambium in the case of Jabea, but in the case of a cambium in the case of Dracaena. So there's no fixed line tree, not tree. It's an array. It's a range of things. And yeah, look, I wouldn't worry about some small little woody plant like a Hedrahelix, for example, in the tree category in most cases. But there might be occasions where I will, and I've certainly braced a rose. I've braced at least 2 roses in my life. So you've got to think of that as their trees. It's the same as one that we talk about, the little Buxus sempervirens that grows outside a McDonald's store. Is that a tree or is it a shrub? Well, I've got photographs of a 15-meter high hedge. I'm guessing many of you would call that a tree. Well, where's the difference? It started its life as a shrub and then it became a tree, or was it always a tree?
And does it matter?
Yeah, exactly. So
just to jolt your memory, Mark, today we were going to look at diagnosis, which we've done, prognosis, and then signs and symptoms.
Signs and symptoms are scary stuff. Okay, so prognosis is about that process of saying, this is what I expect to happen if, and there'll be a whole pile of ifs. So if you do nothing, this is what I expect will happen next. If you take this management option, this is what might happen next, or this is what I anticipate. And that's used as a part of the feedback loop. That's the doctor saying to you, go home, take 2 Panadols. If the pain persists, come back, go to the hospital, whatever it might be. And we're not good at that as a population as a whole. What we're really good at as a population as a whole is saying, I took 2 Panadol, I woke up the next morning, I still had a splitting headache, and the doctor's an idiot. And that's because we have this, as a population, generally this view that diagnosis fits into that one event, rather than seeing treatment as a part of the diagnostic process. So treatment or management is a part of diagnosis. You may think that you're controlling something and things might start to go pear-shaped very rapidly. And certainly I've done that. I've certainly, on more than one occasion, seen a tree, realized that it's got some form of arthropod causing problems for it, gone in and treated, and realized in particular mites, trying to get some mite and hemiptera damage mixed up can be very easy to do. And, depending on the chemicals you're using and how they're using, they don't cross over all the time. So, if I'm right with the diagnosis, then fine. And the other thing is you get symptoms that do confuse. For example, I could share with you pictures of sublethal herbicide damage that really does look like mite or hemiptera damage in its earlier stages. And you'd sit there and think, well, am I getting the right end results? Is my prognosis correct? I've gone in, I've treated the insect or I've treated the mite, and yet things are still looking the same. In fact, they're getting worse. And that's a good part of the feedback loop. So one of the things that's crucial in diagnosis are symptoms and signs. And boy, is this a hot potato area, because there's often arguments about what's a symptom and what's a sign. In strict terms, a symptom is what the plant does. A sign is what the organism does, or the disease does. So it doesn't have to even be a living organism. For example, a spiraling wound around the base of a tree is a sign. Why?
Because it's been caused by the actions of something.
Yeah. But it
Reaction?
also could be a symptom. And this is where it gets that gray area. So if it was lightning and it just, the pressure wave beat the bark off, then that tells you that that's the result of the lightning doing it. If it was a disease that came in through the vascular system and caused a large stem canker that was spiraling in shape, then that's a symptom. Same thing, two different responses. So, as I said, there'll be areas where they cross over, but keep it in mind. So what would, and David, I can see you there, your face is up and you've got a handsome beard, better than mine by a long way. So I'm going to ask you a question, David. If you had some beetles feeding on a tree, what might be some signs?
Okay, well, you might have the tree might be sort of senescent, it might be dying back.
Okay, so that's what the tree's doing. So they would go into the symptom category. So
I would say the bits missing out of the leaves is
it's missing out of the leaves. So
sorry, yeah,
Gelatinized leaves.
chewing. So you're going to have some leaf material or bark material or whatever removed. Yeah. So chewing. And so the frass that they leave or the physical damage they cause, they are signs. Okay. But you're absolutely right, David. The symptoms would be the tree could be senescing, the tree could be flushing with new foliage out of season. The tree could be not flowering when it should be if it's something that eats the flower. So those are all symptoms and signs. Just you can see how they get very close there to being the same thing. So there's an important reason to split them apart.
Mark, sorry, Mark, can I just jump in there?
Go ahead.
When we have a perfectly healthy tree that's dying because of something impacting it, it's not senescing. It's dying.
It is dying.
And that is one of the, it's a too often constant I see. You have a perfectly healthy tree in the middle of suburbia, a couple of dead parts of it, and somebody says the tree's in senescence. It's like bullshit. It's dying. Something's killing it. You know, we don't. So just yeah. I'll get off my horse now. But
no, look,
trees that are being killed by pests or diseases are not in senescence. They are dying. It's a different thing.
Might be. If you, again, this is grey. So please, Borrelcott's got lots of grey.
In a couple of 100 years, we might be able to talk about senescing trees in an urban environment. If we can go out to the bush, we can do it, have a different conversation.
Okay, well, let's come in.
I'll hand it back to you.
Let's go to the urban area. How about if we had something like Acacia decurrens, which typically lives, or longifolia, you know, these trees that live 10, 15 years, Virgilia. Virgilia has been renamed, by the way, for those of you who are fanatics about getting your genera right. I don't know what it's called nowadays, but they changed it to something else. So these short-lived trees can be senescing, and that's why they're exposed to disease. So again, one of the things that's been really wonderful in the COVID experience is we've started to see some of this language be a part of everyday society. And these are these things called comorbidities or other things that contribute to things. So if you've got you know, typically for us here, Acacia decurrens gets to about 10, 15 years of age, starts to get longicorn, Acacia longicorn, Acacia longicorn does a fair amount of damage to it. All of a sudden you start seeing them decline very rapidly and then dying. So yes, I take your point, Shane, that it's not a true senescence in the fact of it getting old. And if you go back to our start, one of the things I did say is that there appears to be some good evidence that at least to a large extent, the genetic material does not degrade over time in at least some trees and possibly in many species of trees. And that's why we can take cuttings and propagate and cuttings and propagate and cuttings and propagate, and 30 generations of cuttings down from cutting grown material, we can still have the same genetic material. So we're not getting it degrading over time. Does that help? So signs strictly are what the organism or the disease does. And then when I say the organism, let's talk about diseases in two different ways. there are biotic diseases. Biotic means living, and there are abiotic diseases. So we break those down a bit. And Peter, I'm sure that we'll have a folder set up in the next month or so with some resources to help. There's lots of great resources out in this, and to her absolute credit and thankfulness, Ruth Karush did a wonderful series on plants, diseases, 4 volumes, and that's available as a free download, which is really amazing. If you were looking for a good basic book for trees, and I'll see if I've got one behind me on the shelves. No, I haven't. Jones and Elliott's disease book, I think it's the 3rd edition. I'll show it to you next thing round. A great collection of images. I accept that for us, many times seeing something is a great way to help us identify. And so they have just a really good collection of images and classified diseases. Sinclair from the US has a great one on diseases. The dilemma is a lot of those diseases aren't here, but the similar diseases here have similar symptoms. So that's why we want to get these symptoms and signs. We want to be able to see other ways we can group things. So the abiotic diseases, for example, can affect a broad range. For example, if it's a herbicide of unrelated plants, it can cause extreme physical damage, a storm. You know, you can go somewhere and see the aftermath of a storm, and just from the physical damage, the signs, you can see that there's been a storm come through. You can walk down after a fire and see evidence of fire damage. And you can see that years later, at some stage or other, hopefully all of you will get to see, you know, branches on the underside with wounds on them. And you'll sit there and you'll scratch your head and you'll think, yeah, what's caused all these branches to have wounds on the underside? And you'll realize that a fire's gone through and the heat's burnt the underside of the branch, scalded the tissue, and the tissue's died off, and you've got these cankers on the underside of the branch. Canker, let me define that. Canker, when I use the word canker, I'm talking about an area of necrotic tissue. Necrotic, dead. So an area of dead tissue, and it could be a canker that's come from an abiotic disease, for example, a motor car. Now, no, this is getting back into that controversial area again, but the motor car was driven by a person, yes, but the impact was the thing, not the person. So we're asking, what is the causal agent? Is the causal agent living, or is the causal agent dead? We're not asking what the causal agent of the causal agent. Otherwise, we might all be sitting there saying, look, this is a God disease. You know,
Well, doesn't that depend on whether the person meant to drive into the tree, Mark?
I'm not going to infer intent, but mechanical damage is mechanical damage. And just to make it clear, mechanical damage, for example, from a car is no different than mechanical damage from another tree hitting it, or no different from a boulder hitting it, no different from any other thing having mechanical impact. So again, it's that allows us just to start to put things into groups. And if we can put things into groups, it does start to make life easier for us in processing it. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, well, you two, that's no use for me. The rest of you are mute. You can unmute if you want. And now's the time to ask questions about symptoms and signs. You should.
Oh, well, I'm just wondering about the difference between disease and an accident, because storm damage and mechanical damage and so on, it to me is accidental damage rather than a disease.
And it's interesting you say that. There's a thing called the International Classification of Diseases. And currently we're working worldwide on ICD-10, International Classification of Diseases 10. And in that, being hit by a motor vehicle or being involved in a motor vehicle accident, being hit by Well, there's not one for hit by a tree. It's a shared category. So anything that's 1 in a million likelihood or less in frequency gets clustered together. So trees are a very small risk, so they're clustered in a shared category in ICD-10, including the collapse of caves and falling of rocks. Beds, death by falling from or on a bed is a disease. It's classified as a disease. The Australian government reports that disease to the World Health Organization each year. And, you know, statisticians love this stuff. We see it as not a disease, but people tend to feel that death is a bad disease overall. And so, yeah, this is what I said, we've become very broad. So, for example, alcoholism, which is not anything else but a psychological disease, maybe some small amount of genetics to it as well, that's a disease. But it's not like there's an organism involved.
So let's go back to your original definition of a disease as being somehow a malfunction of the organism.
Anything that causes, yeah, anything that causes. So if a person is an alcoholic, they're not functioning as they should. Even if they're a reformed alcoholic, they're not functioning as they should. And so we say they've got a disease. Male pattern baldness, Peter, it's a disease, okay? And it is. Does it necessarily significantly affect us? Oh, and you'll be glad to know that it really isn't a problem so long as we wear a hat and we watch for melanomas, scalp melanomas. You know, we're lucky because when we were kids, we had hair. But as we got older, it started to recede and disappear. So, yeah, it's considered to be a disease. So disease is such a broad concept, but it's a useful concept in the context of if the tree is not performing right, why? And so we say it's diseased. That's a nice, simple answer. The next question is why? And the first bit to that is to say, well, what sort of tree is it? You know, I was writing the diagnosed tree diseases unit for Melbourne Polytech last year in November, and I'm thinking, wow, hang on a second here. It's November. There'll be things that aren't diseases that might look like diseases. And November, almost inevitably, 1 or 2 people call me up and say, look, coming out, my tree is losing its leaves. Okay. And I get out there and it's a fiddlewood. And I say, well, it's November. That's what it's meant to be doing. So it's not disease. So knowing what the tree is useful. In fact, it's one of the best diagnostic tools that we have. If we can figure out what genus it is, what species it is, it usually starts to narrow things down. And that's because there are diseases that are more likely to affect some things than others. So I'm proudly married to a Wiradjuri woman. I've got Wiradjuri kids. Keep them away from alcohol. I know it's a problem for them genetically. You know, it's going to be a great issue. My wife is high risk because my wife has is a little older than me, just a day or 2 or more, and my wife has therefore greater exposure to COVID. And we saw this. This is this issue again of comorbidity. So being Aboriginal means that she has an increased risk factor from COVID. And so being able to identify the tree is one of the first steps if we can. And that's not always possible. And so I've always said it's the same process. If they know that I'm Caucasian, that's great. Drop me in a vat of potassium permanganate and I might not look so the same color. I'll go dark brown fairly quickly. And so they might not recognize, you know, that I'm thing. You see some of the Asians have had eye surgery to alter their eye shape to make them look more European, so, or Caucasian. So you're going to get these changes that are difficult. So somebody comes in on an ambulance stretcher into a hospital. The doctor doesn't say, well, I don't know the surname, forget it, I can't do anything. The doctor goes through the process and starts to work out, diagnose and prognosticate. In fact, before the doctor even does it, the triage nurse does it. The triage nurse says, what general group of problems is this in? And so we need to be doing the same thing. What general group, what do I know about it? And so they have a whole pile of things. For example, if you get in there and there's severe bleeding, I guess you're going to get attention quicker than if you go in there and you've got pain. Except if the pain relates to your heart or your appendix, then they might speed that process up a little bit. If that pain relates to a broken hip, they're going to speed it up a bit. And so it's the same for us. There are diseases that we'll look at. We'll just simply say, run it cool, don't worry about it, play it out, let's have a look and see how it goes. And that is what we're doing as arborists all the time. We just don't realize it. Constantly we're doing it. We just let diseases slide because they're not that significant. The dilemma becomes what happens when you get there and the triage nurse says, needs immediate attention. You get there and you're asked by a client, what am I going to do? I need this sorted out. This has got too far. Or you see it and you look at it and say, if this continues, we're going to have problems. And so that is when you need to start honing your diagnostic skills to a greater level and narrowing it down. And, you know, it's like any skill, it's practiced. The more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And there's some great news. There's some great tools now to help. Who has come across Google Lens? Anyone?
Yeah.
Anyone here not know of Google Lens? Let me know. Yell out. Yeah, okay. Google Lens is on Android and iOS systems. It's a service by Google that allows you to take a photograph of anything, and Google will attempt to match it against its photo database. So, for example, if I were to take a picture of, I've got a Wi-Fi microscope box here, if I take a photograph of that with my Google Lens, it would tell me where I can buy that from, who's got it in stock, what it is. I mean, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. And so it's useful in identifying plant material. It's useful in identifying an automobile. It's not good at people. It is really good at people, but the software is restricted in the way it's used in people. Otherwise, we'd all be stalkers. So they've restricted how that does. But if you load your own photos to Google Photos, we had a situation recently when the kids were younger, they looked a lot different. You probably all experienced that process. We had a photograph the other day that came over and the question was, which kid is it? And there was a debate about it. And finally I said, look, there's only one way to find this out, and that's to ask Google. And within a flash, Google had identified which child it was. Without us saying, which child is it? We took a photograph of it and it said, this is Ethan. It knew from all the shots of Ethan that that's who it was. So it's certainly good for facial recognition. It's just they don't make that facility available so you can go around taking photographs of everyone saying, who's this, who's this, who's this? And your photographic information is not being revealed. So there's not a whole pile of criminal organizations out there that can identify me just from this mug. There are countries, by the way, that have that process. And you might have seen in the media in recent times that facial recognition software, for example, being used in China on a number of occasions now to pick up somebody who has died, somebody who's been kidnapped as a baby, you know, a 6 or 12-month-old, and then they've picked them up on the street with their facial recognition software. You think about that, it's pretty amazing. Now, let me see if I can get some of the things up there. Is there any reference on trees being 20 times more complicated than humans? Amy, yes, there is. I have a horrible old publication that compares poplars with human genome, human protein production. And you understand that still to this day, many chemicals we use and many chemicals that have commercial or health applications are extracted from plants because we can't produce them ourselves. We were the best chemists in the world, and 250, 300 years of good chemistry, we still can't replicate many chemicals that are produced by plants. So yes, if you want, I can have a hunt down and find that. If it's critical, send an email to Peter and I will hunt that paper down. Woody perennial, yes, I think that's fine. Frass, Kyle used the word frass. Frass is something that the insect does. It's a waste product. And so frass is a sign. It's always a sign because frass is done by the organism. So it chews, it poops. In fact, my best disease, my most profitable disease, bar none, is what, Kath? Possums. Possums. The number of people that I go out and look at their trees and I say, yep, you have possums grazing. And the thing that I use to identify it is the scat on the ground. Scat, just another one of those nice words for saying the poop. Entry and exit wounds, again, great signs. So you're starting to get the concept. Don't understand that one, David, but that's cool. So here's a question Amy's got. The roots were cut mechanically damaged on a Ficus rubiginosa 5+ years ago in a park setting, and it has been 80% defoliated for 3 years. This would not be a disease. No, that is a disease. It may be what we call a disease complex. Oh, another concept. Disease complex means more than one disease coming together. That's part of why we have a lot of people over the age of 60 dying from COVID. They actually have a disease complex, more than one factor. There's this issue of comorbidity. So the roots are cut. That's mechanical damage. I know that's done by a person. I know it could be done by a wombat. I know it could be done by a landslide. I know it could be done by lots of things. And if you want to call it biotic, I'm fine with that. Just say what it is. You know, somebody's cut the roots, and we don't need to define it as biotic or abiotic in that case, just like you have, Amy. But why is it 80% defoliated? You know, I cut roots of Ficus rubiginosa, big trees with 2 meter and 3 meter diameter trunks. And I cut them all the way around. And they can defoliate for a little while, but why is it still defoliated? Something is happening. And is it not getting enough water? Is it, if they're small figs, is it fig leaf beetle? Fig leaf beetle's notorious for taking out small figs and destroying them. So we'd need to know more about that disease. We need more questions. And that's one of the things we're going to encourage you to do is to email into Peter diseases that you would like to have looked at, things you'd like to have as a, you know, what do you think this might be? We're not going to get the things right, but we'll, if you're happy to gather information and answer questions, we'll see what we can do to narrow that down for you. What is a big yellow caterpillar? Well, I have an answer for that. A big yellow caterpillar is a big yellow caterpillar. I guess the question is, how do you find what's got a big yellow caterpillar? It's interesting. I posed this question to Dr. Don Hermanson Evans. Now, I've got to be fair. The Dr. Don, if you're watching, I know you're wearing a purple shirt today, but he's a physicist, not an entomologist. But Don is one of the leading lepidopterists in Australia. Brilliant man. And I asked him that question because when I was at university studying computer science, Don was my professor, and Don would say, you're going out and doing tree work this weekend, look for any caterpillars for me. I want caterpillars and grow them on. So he wanted to know what he could identify from the larvae. And so I asked him about 7 or 8 years ago, Don, what percentage of butterflies and moths, Lepidoptera, do you think you could identify from the larvae? He said, about 5%. It's not a lot. You can do better than that by looking at the host. So if you know what they're growing on, you've got a better chance of getting it down than by looking at the larvae. So finding the larvae is one part, the host gives you far more information. And the best thing to do is to grow them on. And if you haven't grown things on, hopefully during the course of the next year or so, you'll start to do that occasionally, and you'll learn things that we didn't even know. Stuff that we had no idea about. Because for entomologists, and I'm going to get into trouble for this, and at some stage or other, I definitely will get into trouble, but entomologists, one of the main things that they're interested in is getting the name published. So if they can name a plant, if they can name an insect, that's great from their side. If they can come up with a paper that gets lots of reproduction, that's fantastic. And it's pretty easy to name an insect. In fact, if you want to name an insect, I can tell you, if you go out, turn your light on for a week, collect every insect that comes to your light, you'll find 4 or 5 species that have never been named. It's as simple as that. The leading hymenopterist in Australia was head of CSIRO's entomology collection. And he said that he hoped that by the time he retired, he'd have got to the stage of naming about 5% of the Australian wasp species. That's not a very large number of them. So, you know, we're talking huge numbers of insects out there. Okay. Google Lens is great for looking at it. And if Google Lens can't narrow it down for you, then the next thing is to start doing those crazy searches. And we'll look at that during one of our further ones. Why don't we could dedicate most of a session to Phytophthora and its management, possibly down the track? The answer is yes. Phytophthora is a fascinating disease. I'm old, so when I started, Phytophthora was a fungus. Now it's not. It's an oomycete or a water mold. It's its own new kingdom. It's really exciting. And the great news is we've made some breakthroughs with management of Phytophthora. Not its cure, but its management. And we've made fairly big breakthroughs, and a lot of those originated in a very small provincial backwards place called Australia. So I think we can give ourselves a good pat on the back as Australians for often being quite innovative, particularly given our view on chemicals in Australia. Is there somewhere that fungi can be identified either from photos or samples? The answer is yes. If they're a fungus that has a big fruiting body that you can see, you can try Lens to start off with, or you can go to a number of field guides. But the big warning, fungal identification now is, and again, to the mycologists that might watch this later on, I apologize, but a lot of it's back down to DNA identification rather than anything else. So we call it Phelinus spur, rather than trying to guess whether it's Phelinus batius, Phelinus robusta, whether they're the same or whether they're different. Again, there is sometimes a lack of specificity, but I just saw a new stinkhorn. It's one of the ones that I haven't seen before in my front yard. I photographed it, and I'm pretty comfortable if I shared my screen. Let me see if I can share my screen.
I will have to make you the host to do that.
Okay. Have we got time? Not really, Peter. We don't have time, but
Okay.
I'll do it next time around. I'll show you how to use Google Lens just to identify something as simple as a fungus. Yeah, there are some good apps out there. The one thing I like about, and I've subscribed and bought to a number of them. I purchased the commercial version of Plant Snap, and it was interesting. I'd have to say on a scale of 1 to 10, those sort of apps get a 6 or a 7, and Lens gets probably an 8 or a 9. The bad thing about Lens is it's free. So it means any person can really start to do some of these things. It's not great at doing things like identifying the species of eucalypt, but it'll certainly tell you that it's a eucalypt quite frequently. And even if it just gets it down to, you know, a smaller group, like it shows you, and I took a picture of something the other day and I wasn't sure, and it came back and said, oh, it's Chris Miller Day. And I said, oh, well, I could have told you that. But the fact that it could tell me that was great. It narrowed it down straight away. So if you're not as familiar with insect families, it can be really helpful in terms of breaking it down. Is light classified as a disease? That's a great question, Luke. The answer is yes. Too much light or too little light can be problematic. And the one that I think of is in my shade house. I have a cyathea. And in the wintertime, we used to pull back the shade cloth and get more light in. And every time I did that, my cyathea would drop the bundle of foliage that it had and go and produce sun foliage. And then when I pulled it back during summertime, it would drop it again and go produce shade foliage. So light can have an impact on how a plant functions. Too much light for a number of plants that are light sensitive can be really problematic. And you've got to think about it. If you're trying to grow, for example, a jacaranda that's nice and straight, you want to make sure there's no far red light coming from nearby. That's, an adjacent tree will do that because it'll quite happily get a phototropic lean. It'll grow away. So there's a second response that causes it growing away. So there's the auxin response, and then your responses to some of your far red lights. Ed Saunders asks, Mark, you mentioned Qtara the other day that fresh green tree mulch was the best thing for trees and for fighting other fungi or rot. Could you go through this again? Yeah, look, that's one of those things that it's quite funny. Still, the ISA's best management practice says pull the mulch away from the base of the tree. Don't let the mulch get up close to the tree. You don't want mulch around the trunk of the tree. And I walked through a forest with a slope on it, and all the mulch is gathered up on the top side of that trunk, and those trees aren't dying or falling over. So it's the first thing that I noticed. The second thing is Linda Chalker Scott. I think it's Horticulture Miss or Tree Miss, one of the two. Her website has canvassed these things from a scientific perspective. And she said, what does the science tell us about mulch? Well, the science tells us several things. And I can give you, in some cases, some of the authors. It tells us that green mulch is better because every part of the breakdown process then makes those elements that are being released, or those solutes that are being released, makes them all available, rather than breaking it down first of all, losing 3/4 of those solutes, and then putting a broken down mulch. You've lost all that early stage. Well, again, I remember it was all about nitrogen drawdown, and a gentleman called Larry Costello did some wonderful work on this. Larry took some mulch and he put it around some big pots with trees growing in them, and he measured the soil nitrogen content, the leaf nitrogen content, using this mulch, and he put it on green. And what he found was that trees that had the green mulch went down, the nitrogen in the soil dropped levels. The nitrogen in the foliage didn't. And the hypothesis is that the microorganisms, whilst they take nitrogen that's from the soil that's available, they don't do it at the detriment of the host, because that host provides a lot of things back to the soil. For example, sugars come from plants, trees in particular, put huge amounts of sugars back into the rhizosphere to feed the organism. So they're getting an advantage out of it. So they've got a vested interest, so to speak, to look after those organisms. So green mulch, he found, was good. What really made it exciting is up until that stage, our Tree Surgeons Guild was very anti the use of, or National Arborist Association as it was by then, very anti the use of green mulch. Well, I am on an acreage and I was just a bad boy because I'd bring the mulch home and put it around my trees. So it's just a really great way to get rid of as much of it as I could. And one of the things that we're told in the earlier days was, well, eucalyptus stuff, it's different than other mulches. It doesn't break down as readily. Well, just so happens that the mulch that Larry Costello used was eucalyptus mulch. So that should give you some degree of confidence that it's not a problem. There are very few diseases that are spread through mulch. And there are a whole pile of diseases that are inhibited and significantly managed by mulch, including that little one we were just talking about, Phytophthora nemomi, and work by Downer, James Downer, out of University of California, on the greater the diversity of fungi in the soil, and mulching is part of that process, the less problematic Phytophthora becomes. So hopefully, Ed, that answers that one for you. Is it biotic or abiotic, or is that a question for Dr. Carl? I'm not sure which one would be. I think it's abiotic and biotic. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And at some stage or other, I'll let you have access to a table that was developed by Sean Tullen and myself that helps break those things down. For the sake of the argument, in the biotics, we include viruses. And this has been a really contentious thing because a virus is not living. A virus is just a set of code, genetic code. But for whatever reason, we always have, and when the Dettol label or the disinfectant label says kills 99.9% of all viruses, you know they're lying, okay? What it does is it renders it unable to replicate, which essentially from a layman's perspective means it's dead. But if we're true, we were really pedantic about things, we'd say, oh no, a virus is not living, therefore we'll put it in the abiotic. But it's the way that it interacts with the biotic system, and the fact that once it's in there, it does behave biotic-like or living-like, that we include viruses into biotic diseases, and we do with people as well. Inoculating mulch. There are some times when I recommend inoculating mulch. My favorite one is if you're going to plant pinus, cedrus, a lot of the gymnosperms from the Americas, or in particular, American species, but right through the European. We don't have really good mycorrhizal fungi that piggybacks onto those species. And as a result, in the early days, our forestry industry wasn't growing as well as it would. So they introduced a number of mycorrhizal fungi into Australia. Amanita muscaria is the most common one, the fairy cap fungi. And if I'm planting a pinus or a cedrus or something like that, and it's autumn time, I'll certainly grab a cap to make sure there is a mycorrhizal inoculation. In most cases, these things will inoculate themselves in time. But it's one of those things, again, that you will look at occasionally, and you'll see 10 trees planted on a farm, all pinus, all from the same stock. It's good stock. 9 of them are going well and 1 of them is not. And that's just that one, for whatever reason, the mycorrhizal association has been knocked back. So, phosphate fertilizer has been used or something like that. Phosphates tend to kill mycorrhizae when they're applied as fertilizers, much the same as phosphates knock back a lot of proteaceae. So in most cases, just simply having organic material there is 90% of the battle, because the spore will land. It'll go through in underneath it. We protect against UV. So those spores mostly spread at night. Remember, night, realistically, or lack of sunlight is about 12 hours a day on average. So day spread spore is usually destroyed by UV radiation. If you think this part of your head is subjected to UV radiation is high, when you're a single cell, a reproductive spore, then you're very exposed. Oh, look, microbiologists argue about the virus argument. There have been hundreds of papers on them. It's just one of those nice little things. And then supersaturation from soil. It's a great question. The answer is yes. You don't need to get the soil to be flooded to get to saturation. And saturation is very similar. It's almost identical in the response that the plant has. So it's similar to being flooded. So one of the things that I often say, and I'm in an area of Sydney that's got Cumberland plain clays. My property is fairly flat. And there have been trees that have been exposed to having their roots saturated now for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. And I planted about a month before the recent floods we're having, I planted 6 fruit trees. And so I'm crossing fingers and hoping like crazy that they'll get past this period of saturated soils. It's also another really good reason why you should never, ever, ever put organic material below the soil level. It should always be on the surface. So that old put cow manure at the bottom, you put cow manure at the bottom, you get saturation, methane, sulfur dioxide, a whole pile of oxidation reduction problems occur in the soil chemistry, and you kill trees very rapidly. So organic material never goes underneath a tree when you're planting it. Hopefully that answers that one. Guys, we've gone past our hour that we allocated, but I'd like to encourage you to start looking at things, finding things, sending them in and saying, hey, what's this? Next time around, I'll share the screen. We'll start having a look at some bits and pieces. If you don't have something, then I'll show you some of the ones that I've got. I've got a few hundred diseases there that have caused me problems or given me great delight, and some anomalies that go with it. So, just last week I saw a root, Peter, of a jacaranda that looked like a corkscrew. It'd gone around in circles about 3 or 4 times. And, when you understand why that root's there and what it was trying to do, it's pretty amazing. And so we'll look at that in future times together. So guys, I'll see you in a month's time, or if you're at war next week, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, guys.
Great discussion, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, mate.
Cheers.